It's easier to say, oh, we're gonna show everybody that we know this league is good with or without Caitlin Clark. We're gonna prove it. But once you talk to your owner buddies and they say, look how much we made. I mean, Indiana Fever came to town. Look how much we're making, right? Once Renee Montgomery and Sheila Johnson talk to the owner of the Las Vegas Aces, talk to the owner of the Chicago Sky, and they say, hey, what was that gate looking like? Oh, damn. That's a lot of money. Indiana had 9 road games moved to larger arenas last year, but just 4 so far for 2026. WNBA teams are moving more games to different arenas this upcoming season, but Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever have significantly fewer of those games. The WNBA's regular season schedule announced Wednesday, including 19 games moved to different arenas, up from 15.
9 down to 4 is the kind of shift that deserves a closer look. Last season, Indiana's road schedule turned into the league's traveling spectacle, with multiple games moved into NBA-sized buildings because standard arenas could not handle the demand tied to Caitlin Clark. This year, that pipeline contracts to just 4 Fever road games in larger venues, even as the league overall increases the number of arena moves from 15 to 19. If the league is louder than ever about growth and demand, the math begins to feel selective. The public-facing explanation usually settles on caution. Clark's groin injury last season becomes the convenient cover story, a way to frame smaller venue commitments as responsible planning.
The Washington Mystics, Connecticut Sun, and Atlanta Dream each moved 1 game against Indiana last year, but none for the upcoming season. The New York Liberty, Portland Fire, Mercury, Valkyries, and Minnesota Lynx are already in NBA arenas, removing any need to move games for bigger crowds. Is part of this due to injuries? Well, they would like you to believe that, I think. They would like you to believe, oh, well, she got injured last year. We don't want to move. We don't want to commit to a bigger arena. God forbid she gets.
But the real-world test already happened. When her availability changed, the crowds did not disappear. Those games still drew, still sold, still proved the Fever were the biggest road magnet in the league. Indiana's road attendance was the clear outlier, around 15,184 per game, roughly 4,000 more than any other team. And Clark only played in 3 of the moved games before the injury. So the question is not whether teams can sell tickets without her on the floor, because they already did. The question is why the one team that consistently produced the strongest road demand is the one getting fewer chances to scale that demand up. Now look at who influences the choices behind the curtain. These venue decisions do not appear out of nowhere. They come from ownership groups, front offices, and league stakeholders who have their own preferences about what the WNBA should look like.
We have names like Renee Montgomery, part owner of the Atlanta Dream. Names like Sheila Johnson, part owner of the Washington Mystics. Sheila Johnson, the same person who threw a fit that Caitlin Clark was named Time Magazine's Woman Athlete of the Year. And she said, why give it to Caitlin Clark? Let's give it to the whole entire league. If you ask me, this is a subtle play from folks like Sheila Johnson and Renee Montgomery. Because at the end of the season, they decreased the amount of Fever games that have been moved to bigger arenas. Yet in totality, they increased the league from 15 games to 19 games.
And whose story gets centered? Start with Atlanta and Washington. Renee Montgomery is part of the Atlanta Dream ownership group. Sheila Johnson is part owner of the Washington Mystics. Johnson is also the same executive who publicly pushed back when Time magazine highlighted Caitlin Clark, arguing recognition should be distributed more broadly across the league. Last season, Atlanta shifted a single Indiana game into State Farm Arena. This year, they shifted none. Washington followed the same pattern. 1 moved game last season, none this year. Connecticut is another data point that makes the trend harder to dismiss. The Sun took a Clark game to TD Garden, the one tied in people's minds to the injury. Now, there is nothing comparable scheduled. If the league truly believed the Fever were the safest bet for demand, you would expect at least one marquee shift to remain on the calendar, not a quiet retreat.
4 times this season. You see how massive the season was? You see how much of a success it was this year? And we only had Caitlin Clark. See, we don't really need her. I told you guys we were going to do this without her. Interesting. The decrease in moved fever games comes after Caitlin Clark played in just 13 games last season. Clark appeared in just 3 of the 9 moved road games, including July 15th against the Connecticut Sun at TD Garden. Clark injured her groin in the fourth quarter of that game and missed the remainder of the season. The Fever remained the league's biggest attendance draw last year, averaging 15,884 fans.
What makes this more telling is that the dip is not limited to one franchise. Chicago and Dallas each had 2 games moved to bigger venues last year. This year, each gets 1. At the same time, the league is not acting like arena moves are off the table. Toronto's expansion team has 5 games shifted across different venues, including dates in Montreal and Vancouver. That is the league signaling clearly that it will rearrange buildings when it wants to maximize attention, crowd size, and market momentum. Put it together, and the pattern is hard to ignore. The total number of moved games rises from 15 to 19. Yet Fever-related moves fall sharply from 9 to 4. If the explanation were simply logistics or a general pullback from bigger buildings, the numbers would flatten across the board. Instead, the league is expanding the tactic while narrowing where it applies, and Indiana is the outlier going in the opposite direction. Zoom in on the 4 big venue dates they actually kept: July 5th against Las Vegas, August 8th against Chicago, August 18th against Toronto, August 20th against Dallas. Every one of them sits well past the opening stretch, when the cameras are loudest and the new season energy is at its peak. Last year, the league leaned into early demand and stacked arena upgrades near the front of the calendar, while the spotlight on Caitlin Clark was still at maximum intensity. This year, the approach reads differently. It looks like an attempt to generate the early season narrative in smaller buildings first, then roll out the larger arenas later, once the initial frenzy cools and attention has to be reignited on purpose.
If I'm an owner of an NBA arena, if I'm in charge of selecting what events gets put in these arenas, well, without a CBA deal reached, why would I want to start already Xing out dates with potential WNBA games, when I can keep those dates open for when a Jonas Brothers come to town, when a Taylor Swift comes to town, when a Luke Bryan or whoever come to town? Why would I start Xing out these dates? I wouldn't. It's not smart. I want to keep those dates open as long as I possibly can.
There is also a practical incentive hiding in plain sight. The collective bargaining agreement still is not finalized, and the 2026 season carries real uncertainty around timing. Arena managers do not like uncertainty. If you run an NBA building, you would rather keep prime dates flexible for events that lock in guaranteed revenue. Touring concerts, major shows, anything with a proven sellout floor. If the calendar ends up with open space, you can always slot in a WNBA date later. What you do not want is committing early, then dealing with reschedules, refunds, or dead inventory if the season timeline shifts. That is why the timing matters as much as the total count. It is not only fewer Fever arena moves. It is fewer and pushed deeper into the year, when those dates are easier to treat like optional inventory rather than a must-book centerpiece. Even the precedent shows how fluid this can be. The Chicago Sky announced in February 2025 that they were moving their first 2 games against Indiana to the United Center. Even though the schedule had already been out since December, many of the biggest venue upgrades do not happen at release. They happen later, once teams run the numbers and realize the original plan undersold demand. That pattern showed up clearly last year. Atlanta came out in March and shifted its May 22nd matchup with Indiana into State Farm Arena, the Hawks building. Dallas followed about a week later, moving a Fever game into American Airlines Center. Those were not baked-in decisions. They were corrections. That is why the quote from the Fever side matters. When a team spokesperson says they cannot speak for what other teams will do, but that opponents can still adjust venues before the season begins, that is basically an open door. It is the league acknowledging that the calendar is not final in the way fans assume. The subtext is simple. Teams will keep watching ticket demand and sponsor interest, and some of them will pivot once the financial upside becomes impossible to ignore. That creates a quiet problem for certain ownership groups. There are influential voices who have spent the last year pushing the idea that the WNBA's growth is bigger than any single player, that it was always headed here, and Clark simply arrived at the right moment. That framing is understandable. It protects legacy, spreads credit, and avoids turning the league story into a one-person headline. But revenue does not care about pride or narratives. Owners who had Indiana on their home slate last season saw the difference in real terms: gate receipts, premium seating, merchandise, and local sponsorship interest. Talk to a team like Las Vegas or Chicago, and you will not get abstract arguments about what the league should be. You will get a business explanation of what happens when the Fever come to town, and the building needs more capacity than usual. Every time an owner publicly argues the league cannot be dependent on one player, they are also boxing themselves in. Because if they do not move that Indiana game into a larger arena, they are choosing to leave money on the table. And if they do move it, they quietly confirm what the market has already been saying. Gate receipts are the simplest truth in the room. Moving a game from a 7,000-seat arena into a 20,000-seat NBA building and selling it out is not a small bump. It changes the entire revenue picture. For franchises that have spent years fighting to stay afloat, that kind of jump is the difference between surviving and actually building something sustainable.
It's open for possible bigger events. And if nobody takes those dates, fine. Then we'll slide a couple Indiana Fever games in here. But until then, we're keeping these dates open.
That is why the league's current approach feels like a balancing act. Some owners want to protect the message that the WNBA's rise is not tied to any single player. But every owner also has to answer to budgets, sponsorship targets, and season ticket economics. When those numbers are staring you in the face, ideology becomes expensive. So what you're seeing looks like a compromise that also doubles as a test. Keep the early schedule conservative. Label it caution, planning, prudence, then monitor what happens in the first wave of games. If attendance holds steady in smaller venues, leadership gets the talking point it wants. They get to claim the demand was structural, not individual, and the league can continue presenting growth as a broad movement. If attendance slips and the money starts leaking, the pivot is already built into the calendar. We have seen how quickly teams can announce venue changes late in the cycle. That becomes the quiet safety valve, the option to restore big arena Indiana dates without admitting the experiment failed. It is a hedge that protects the narrative. Either way, the risk is that last season already provided evidence the demand was not fragile. Even with Clark missing most of the year, Indiana still drove the biggest road crowds in the league by a wide margin. Those seats were sold, and those upgrades were justified before anyone knew an injury would change the season. That is what makes the current bet feel unnecessary. They are not trying to create demand from scratch. They are choosing to restrain demand and see if it redirects elsewhere. And that redirection is the real gamble. The league is betting that new storylines can carry the weight early, and that the audience Clark brought in is now sticky enough to follow expansion narratives, new rivalries, and rising stars without needing the Fever as the engine every week. It might work. If it does, the league gets a broader base and a cleaner growth story. If it does not, the fallback is obvious, and it will arrive through a wave of late venue announcements that suddenly treat Indiana games like premium inventory. Again, this is the real experiment hiding inside the schedule. Either the league has turned a wave of curiosity into durable fandom, or it is about to learn that star gravity still drives the casual audience. Sustained growth takes more than one breakout season, and it also takes a media plan that matches how people actually consume sports. That is where the ratings narrative comes in. The league and Nielsen both leaned on record viewership to argue the momentum is bigger than any single name, even in a year when Caitlin Clark only logged 13 games. On the surface, that sounds like proof of a new baseline. But the load-bearing detail is which broadcasts carried those numbers. Fever games kept showing up at the top of the audience charts, including games Clark did not play, because viewers tuned in hoping she would return, checking in on the storyline, or wanting to see how Indiana looked without her. This season, with fewer Indiana games placed in premium buildings and premium windows early, the league is about to get a cleaner read on the floor. What is the core audience when the biggest draw is not consistently positioned as the weekly centerpiece? Are people watching WNBA basketball broadly, or are they showing up for specific stars, rivalries, and narratives? The outcome is easy to frame either way, and that is the point. If ratings hold, the messaging will be that the product has matured into a property that stands on its own. If ratings soften, the explanation will shift to external variables, CBA uncertainty, timing concerns, scheduling noise. Then the quiet adjustments return, the late venue moves, the better time slots, the same playbook we already saw last year when teams like Washington and Connecticut shifted Indiana games after the calendar was already public. Right now, there is still empty space on the calendar for certain teams, and that silence is doing a lot of work. But the real tell will come later, when the season gets closer and front offices start lining up projected revenue against last year's results. That is when you see how quickly the language changes. Caution turns into opportunity. Scheduling becomes flexible. The same obstacles that sounded permanent suddenly become solvable once the financial gap is staring everyone in the face. Because in pro sports, narratives matter until the ledger disagrees. Owners can champion the idea that the league's rise is bigger than any one player, and they can mean it sincerely. But when the decision is between a 7,000-seat gate and a 20,000-seat gate, the conversation stops being philosophical. It becomes operational. Premium seats, suites, sponsorship packages, local partner activations, those are not abstract concepts. They are immediate dollars, and the difference is too large to ignore for long. That is why the public posture from prominent stakeholders only tells half the story. People can critique individual recognition and still understand exactly what a fever date does to demand. They can push a league-first message and still react when a single matchup doubles the business upside of a home game. The market has already answered whether the Clark-driven surge is real. Attendance patterns and broadcast behavior have made that clear. The real question is what the league chooses to do with that reality. Does it fully lean in and treat the biggest draw like the biggest draw? Or does it ration those moments to protect a broader narrative? Right now, the strategy looks like a careful split. Say the growth is not dependent on one player, while still reserving just enough Indiana games in upgraded venues to collect some of the upside. This cautious middle approach helps almost no one. Fans who want a realistic chance to see Caitlin Clark in person get fewer opportunities. Teams that could maximize revenue by upgrading buildings are asked to accept smaller gates early, which is another way of saying they are being asked to leave money on the table. And the league is putting itself in position to run a live experiment that becomes dangerous if the numbers soften when the biggest draw is not consistently placed in the biggest settings. Expansion gives them a convenient shield. Toronto's rollout, with multiple games shifted into alternate venues, lets the league point to geographic growth and say the strategy is about reaching new markets, not feeding one storyline. That may be true as far as it goes, but it does not answer the central question that actually matters for the business. Was last season a one-time spike driven by the Clark effect that will naturally cool off? Or did she create a durable audience that stays engaged even when she is not the weekly centerpiece? This season is set up to reveal the baseline, and it is also set up to be explained away if the baseline is not flattering, because the messaging options are already built in. If early attendance and viewership hold, the league will call it validation and treat it as proof the product has reached stability. If the numbers fall, the league can point to uncertainty and framing, to timing and negotiations, to external noise, and then make quiet midstream adjustments that restore the most profitable matchups to the biggest venues. That is why the late winter announcements matter. Watch February and March, and watch who suddenly finds a path to a larger building. Watch how quickly practicality overrides principle when the difference between last year's receipts and this year's projections becomes impossible to spin. The league is trying to prove it never needed Clark to begin with, while also keeping her as the emergency lever if the experiment starts to fail. They want to sell the idea that she simply arrived at the perfect time and that the league is now strong enough to keep climbing no matter how many games she plays. 13, 40, somewhere in between, the message is the same. The product is bigger than the player, it is a confident bet, and there is a version of the future where it is the correct one, where the league builds a stable audience that does not rise and fall based on a single name. But there's a cost to running that bet in real time. If you downshift the most reliable draw while you try to prove a broader point, you risk turning what should be the most profitable season into a controlled slowdown. And in pro sports, lessons about pride and narrative do not stay theoretical for long. They show up on financial reports. They show up in sponsorship renewals, and they show up in the way owners start making decisions that contradict the league's public messaging. That is why the next wave of venue and scheduling updates will be the real indicator. Track which matchups suddenly get upgraded. Watch which teams find availability in bigger buildings. Pay attention to how quickly earlier caution disappears when the revenue projections start to look weaker than last year's results. The gap between what gets said in public and what gets done behind the scenes will tell you whether the strategy is holding or whether the market is forcing a pivot. Do you see this as smart long-term planning to avoid over-reliance on one star, or as a self-inflicted mistake that leaves money on the table for the sake of optics? So, here we are at the real ending. Not the one the league is trying to sell, but the one the numbers will force into the open. The WNBA is attempting something ambitious. It is trying to prove it can stand on its own, that it can keep record momentum without leaning on one superstar as the weekly centerpiece. If that works, it is a statement about the product. It is stability. It is a league that finally has a true baseline audience, not just a moment. But if it does not work, there is no speech that can cover the gap between a 7,000-seat gate and a 20,000-seat gate. There is no talking point that can replace premium seat money, corporate buy-ins, and the kind of electricity that follows the fever into any city. At IN professional sports, ideology lasts right up until it becomes expensive. Then reality takes the microphone. And the most revealing part is this. You will not need a press release to know which direction the league is heading. You will see it in the late venue swaps. You will see it in the suddenly available NBA arenas. You will see it in the time slots that get quietly upgraded because teams do not do those things to make a statement. They do them when they realize the statement is costing them. That is why the next few weeks and months matter more than any debate on TV. The schedule will tell you the truth. If the early numbers hold, they will claim victory and call it proof the league has arrived. If the numbers dip, watch how fast the caution disappears and how fast the fever become premium inventory again. Either way, this season is going to expose what the league really believes, not what it says. And once the results are in, there will be no hiding from the conclusion. If you want to stay ahead of the next move before the headlines catch up, follow Courtside Leaks for the updates they will not frame honestly until they have to. We have every angle covered, every leak, every backstage twist, every moment they will not show you. Hit like, subscribe, drop a comment, and share this video.